Greetings, comrades. Welcome to the first episode of the PanAfrikast. I am your host, Saber, aka Sabernetics, and I'm joined with my fellow co-hosts, Lecton, Stella, and Jabir. Lecton, would you like to say hello?
Hi, hello. I'm Lecton, Global South Organizer out of Jamaica, Pan-Africanist, and just general lover of the betterment of people.
Hey, name is Stella Moon. I'm a content media juggernaut. I'm a transgender communist, and I'm just ready for things to pop off. Sitting in my bunker.
I am Jabir Asa, a resident American Black person. Uh, I am in a work study program with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, interested in helping Black people build revolutionary socialism here in America and abroad. It's good to be with y'all, comrades. Can't wait to get started.
Yeah, so today we will be talking about the situation in between Israel and Palestine, but we want to initially ensure that we do not conflate Judaism and Zionism, because I find that a lot of people either tend to make that conflation, or people tend to use that as a means to shut down any conversations about what's actually happening in Israel, or between Israel and Palestine right now as well.
Yeah, we do not in any way condone anti-Semitism. We are very much in solidarity, totally and completely, with Jewish comrades, and any thing that could be interpreted as anti-Semitism on our part. If y'all want to discuss it, y'all can bring it up in good faith with us, and we will definitely do the self-crit necessary to make sure that our Jewish comrades are comfortable with the content of our podcast. We love y'all, and we hope that we're taken in good faith as we discuss the topic of anti-imperialism as it relates to Israel and Palestine. What about you, Lecter? That sound good to you?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. I think another thing, just to kind of further drive home the fact that there is like a very significant difference. I mean, one of the main founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl himself, like within his manuscripts, does admit that he's an atheist. So like the idea the idea that Zionism is truly a genuine expression of Judaism is just generally false.
Could you elaborate more on that in terms of explaining why we say a conflation of Judaism and Zionism, why that's just a almost undeniable fact?
Oh yeah, okay. So generally speaking, when we think about Zionism, or when we even think about like the manufacturing of the Zionist entity, we kind of have this idea of well, Jews are being persecuted in Europe. They needed someplace to go. They then left and chose Palestine as sort of the safe place for them to go, to protect themselves, or to no longer be persecuted within Europe. However, this story leaves out very critical elements of the way that it developed, and just the general attitude of Europe against forms of religion or even atheism at the time, and kind of removes a lot of context to the development of uh, the settler colonial state that is Israel. Um, and so what was done in this case, in a similar sense to the way that like America was formed with regard to its sort of manifest destiny and its idea that, okay, well, we deserve this land of indigenous people. This is precisely what was done. But in the case of America, it was done in the name of Christianity. But in the case of Israel, it's being done in the name of Judaism. But in reality, when we observe the actual ways in which Judaism itself was structured and the ways in which it sought to express itself, it did not do so in a way that aligns with the way in which Zionism seeks to express it. Oftentimes, when you try to have certain types of conversations, in particular with people who are Zionists, you recognize that their understanding of the sort of depths of Judaism does not go as deep as you'd expect it to, as someone who, always claims to be, practicing the Jewish faith. You kind of recognize that the their ideas are very much obscured by what ultimately is a form of whiteness and white supremacy and settler colonialism.
It seemed like, at least from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the partition that was drawn up essentially separated the region into like 3 areas. So you have like the West Bank, which is essentially like under sort of military rule by Israel, and I believe that was occupied since 1967. And under that particular region, it's essentially like complete like martial law, in the sense that there is, checkpoints in various regions, and the sort of Palestinians that are living there are very, very restricted in terms of where they can move. Even in the case where they're dealing with some very serious like health concerns, for example, or some injuries are even inflicted upon them by the Israeli military, right? And so you have these checkpoints, and there's been like many situations whereby people have either suffered very serious health consequences for the fact that they haven't been able to reach the emergency services in time. I can go into a little bit more details about that in a second. But you also have the Gaza Strip, which is what most people would understand to be like the sort of open air, like prison type thing, in the sense that it's very difficult for the sort of Palestinian people living there right now to leave that region and to move into other regions, whether it's going into like Jerusalem, for example, which is home to at least one holy site that they can't even visit. It's various holy sites in Jerusalem, but then also going towards areas like Jordan and even Egypt, for instance. And then you also have, of course, Jerusalem as well, which is essentially the international city center, which is occupied by both like Jews and Jewish people and Arabs as well. And in total, I believe that there are roughly like 5 million Palestinians caught up within these three different sectors as well.
So it's a very populous region for Palestinians, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And when you look at Jerusalem, for example, people would like to say that, for example, that this is a place that's very progressive, very democratic, for instance. But it is definitely the case that it is quite literally like an apartheid state, in the sense that there are like different laws that apply to sort of Israelis versus the Palestinians, whether it has to do with, and they also have like different kinds of identification, different driver's licenses as well. There's different roads that they have to travel on, for example, things like that. So it's definitely, when people say it's an apartheid state, it isn't just an appeal to emotion in that sense. It's quite literally enshrined into the laws as well.
Is there like an example we can cite of like how it's codified in law?
Well, yeah, as I said, like if you look at the identification, for instance, like they need to have different IDs and driving licenses. Yeah, exactly. And also, they literally quite literally in many areas cannot drive on the same roads, for instance. So it's quite horrific in that sense as well. There's also quite a lot of segregation in the education system too, which is something that I found to be quite shocking.
Then people wonder why we say that the system itself is institutional. Like this is a blatant example of like the structural racism that we're always criticizing in the first place, where it's literally baked in to the system. So when people try to talk about racism as something that's divorced from the system, they're never able to have the right conversation, right? Because they are like not working from the right framework of what racism even looks like materially, because it's more than just this horseshit. There's different dictionary definition of different colors and looking different and all that shit. There are real material differences and real ways it plays out. So like in one country, racism might look like limiting, black and brown people's like access to like roads and schools and infrastructure and voting and whatnot. And then another country might go as far as like picking and choosing like who gets to drive, who gets to, in some countries' cases, who even gets to work. So this idea that structural racism can be divorced from practical racism is like ridiculous because like those things are one and the same. Like racism itself is structural, and it's through that structure that they put it into practice in the first place, comrades. So, just defining what we're talking about when we discuss the racism that happens in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is super important. What are your thoughts on the subject, Stella?
I mean, so there is definitely kind of like a lot to talk about. I think it's like so when you brought up the understanding it from like understanding structural racism and understanding how it plays a part. Obviously, I think this is kind of like the best time to talk about that. Like so, like what? So I think in like a greater capacity, like how what this is internationally, like because like I think for a lot of people, right, when they come into the Israeli-Palestine conflict, a lot of them are told. So you're either told two things from this side. You either were raised as a Zionist, like I was, straight up, and you were fed a bunch of propaganda, or you were kind of given this sort of secular, it's fighting over religion, right? There's this sort of Orientalist view that like, well, the Middle East has always been fucked up, even though it's ahistorical, and it kind of ignores or actually actively hides the United States role in it. So therefore it says, oh, well, you have a bunch of Jews in one place and a bunch of Muslims in another place, so of course they fight. And so when it gets into people who think that like, people's response is like, oh, well, why are they even fighting? And they'll see images of stuff and they won't have any context, and they'll be like, oh, well, just stop fighting over religion and land, like it's that easy, right? Because when you live in the cushiness of America. But I think it's important to understand that this isn't obviously the religion is used as sort of the vehicle, as sort of justifications for many different sides. Religion is almost, I want to say tertiary to like the main issue, which is settler colonialism, right? And I think when people who don't necessarily have an understanding of settler colonialism just sees people fighting, so they don't understand that like, no, this is a group of colonizers. This is a colonizing government waging a genocide on a group of indigenous people. Like that's exactly what it is.
There's a greater logic at play here, right? Yeah.
And so like when you kind of come from that framework, when you kind of just move out that like, oh, well, this is something that will quote unquote kind of always happen. What you need to start looking at that specific settler colonialism like interplay, and then you need to start to scope out wider, because obviously it's a wider scope. It's not just what's happening in Israel and Palestine isn't just happening in Israel and Palestine. What's happening there is also like controlled by a lot of American and European powers, and for a very specific purpose and reason.
You're talking about spreading the goal of imperialism and colonization of the entire globe, right?
Yeah, well, and not just that, but just having the fact that like, when you understand that like, why Israel was made, right? Israel was made as essentially to be like, there's like every, when you understand like the entirety of the Middle, like there's kind of two real reasons why like the West has an interest in the Middle East, right? One is the resources, market they have everywhere, but two was also like which is kind of never really wasn't brought up much as kind of like a stopping point against the Soviet Union, right? Like after World War II, there was this real big push in order to make sure that like essentially the bases are taken care of. That like you're not kind of as communism quote unquote spreads, it doesn't necessarily like get to areas you don't want it to get to, and like the focus on like West Asia, what we call the Middle East, was that very important stuff, and that kind of just blows over up until today. That's why that's why we back fascist governments like Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's very had a very circular purpose. Nowadays, you could say it's mainly for resource management and making sure to keep up an ally in the Middle East. But like there is still that undercurrent of like we have to make sure any sort of like socialist uprising, any sort of like proletarian, any sort of decolonial like uprising, these sorts of resistances never take a foothold.
Exactly. Not only are you correct, comrade, like in terms of like what they don't bring up about the narrative. When's the last time you heard somebody talk about the fact that Stalin's whole support for the founding of Israel in the first place was the idea that like a Jewish state that had like Russian backing could like be a strong supporter against imperialism against Jewish people. He thought that he was going to have an ally in the region in anti-imperialist Israelis, and that was the entire interest. Now, obviously, Zionists who are opportunists, totally didn't let that materialize to be the reality. But like when we talk about so-called anti-Semitic Soviet Union, like it bears itself out in some ways, but in very many other ways, they really thought that Israel was supposed to be a bastion of anti-imperialism against Palestinians and against for Palestinians and for Jewish comrades. So the fact that it's going the path that it's going down is very much something the USSR, at the very least in its onset, didn't have in the cards. But we're gonna get smeared for that take. But I mean, it's not hard to find documentation to read about this shit. It's really wild. Had you heard about that, Lecter?
No, actually, that's the first time I heard about it. But with regard to just varying positions and just varying ideas existing, especially within the early sort of developmental stages of Zionism, is something that I've heard a few times before. However, when we kind of take a look at especially like just Theodor Herzl's understanding and development of it, it started off as more of a quite liberal, if you want to think about it that way, but over time got more and more fascist, as we all know, quite a liberal, a fascist please for sure. And Theodor Herzl definitely went there. And just over time, it got more and more reactionary because, its founding and its framework was in, the existing British Empire. I think, just to kind of take it a bit back to the history again, the way in which the way in which Palestine was determined to be the place that Israel should be was that the Zionist Congress made an agreement with Britain such that they were allowed to take this land from Britain. And it's also important to note that this Congress was seeking to take over various lands across the world. One place that they had was that they planned on, for example, was Uganda, because Uganda was also under British colonial rule for some period of time. So, it's very important to kind of look back at the way in which it was developing. The idea that Palestine was the only place that Jews could go was something that they eventually was a conclusion that they eventually came to, but it was after they looked at various other places and for various reasons kind of came to the idea of maybe we don't like this place, maybe we don't like this place. So it wasn't like this sort of the idea that it was sort of this instantaneous, oh well, this was definitely the place we needed to go, or oh well, this was something that was almost spontaneous, is very much incorrect. Actually, if you look back at it, it was very planned, it was very organized, it was very much done through the yoke of British imperialism to sort of develop the state as it is. So when we understand that specific grounding of the Zionist entity, we recognize that it could never be anything but an extension of the existing hegemony, an extension of white supremacist settler colonialism.
That's a strong point. So here's a quote from Vyacheslav Molotov, who was a high-ranking, important member of Stalin's regime. He says, "Everyone objected to recognizing the state of Israel, but us, me and Stalin. Some asked me why we favored it. We are supporters of international freedom. Why should we be opposed if, strictly speaking, that meant pursuing a hostile nationalist policy? In our time, it's true, the Bolsheviks were and remained anti-Zionist. Yet it's one thing to be anti-Zionist and anti-bourgeois, and quite another thing to be against the Jewish people. We proposed, however, an Arab-Israeli union for both nations to live there together. We would have supported this version if it could have been arranged. That's what we would have supported. Otherwise, we favored an Israeli state. Israel has turned out badly. But Lord Almighty, that's American imperialism for you." So we have a high-ranking official literally talking about how they thought that supporting Israel was the best option for a long-term anti-imperialist strategy to benefit both Palestinians and Israel. And that just ended up being straight up the wrong take. But it was the logic that was fueling their choice to recognize Israel and support Israel. And that's important to bring up. We also have the Maoist internationalist movement extrapolating on Molotov's defense of Stalin. So they say Stalin has been criticized for his recognition of Israel. There is limit to what the revolutionary forces are capable of. In the case of the existence of Israel, the progressive forces were not able to stop its creation as a separate, exclusive state. Once created, the question became whether or not to recognize it. From Molotov's quote above, it's clear that Stalin would not recognize the right to self-determination of only those nations with progressive impact. And he said Molotov thought that not recognizing Israel would have been against the Jewish people. They believe they should not oppose the fait accompli in Israel, though they would have preferred a different outcome. So this is, again, supposedly thoughtless as Stalin giving a quite thoughtful analysis of his understanding of the situation. And he ended up thinking that not supporting Israel was like the actual anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish thing to do. Now, history has just shown us that wasn't the fucking case. And it's totally fine to like have a discussion around that basis, but we have to like, talk about the facts when we talk about like who has what to say on the existence of that nation and what were the like factors at play in the time that it was coming to exist in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think another thing that is worth pointing out is the fact that within Palestine, before even British occupation of the region, Jews and Arabs lived in the region without really any true major conflict amongst each other, right? It wasn't as though, it's not as though the creation of Israel all of a sudden brought in this group that had never existed outside of white people, but the way in which it's sort of perceived oftentimes does not sort of line up with what existed at the time. Jews were already in Palestine before the creation of the Zionist entity. This is just a historical fact.
And another thing to note too is that like in the aftermath of the founding of Israel, it must be noticed or emphasized that like there quite literally was a kind of like ethnic cleansing whereby like 1 million Palestinians were expelled from their homes. 500 Arab villages were razed, and those who didn't leave were pretty much killed straight up. And like even like the UN, I believe the UN was saying things like they had the right to return, but of course that hasn't been upheld for reasons that are for reasons that we've essentially alluded to already, which is that like Israel is pretty much a settler colonial state, which is essentially upholding the interests of the US. And I guess one thing before you jump in, Lecton, is that like if it wasn't for the backing of the US, Israel would probably collapse.
Oh yeah, 100% it would. Just looking at how much money is constantly pumped into Israel, I believe it's what, 3 million or is it 3 billion? Is it a B or an M?
It's a B. It's a B with a capital basketball, nigga.
$3 billion a year at least is being pumped into Israel, and that's not including all of the extra packages that have been getting throughout this recent especially the recent 11-day war that the Palestinian resistance was putting up against Israel. So you're talking about a lot of money that, I'm just saying, if you're an American, you should be pissed as fuck, because that's money that could very easily be going towards a lot of the sort of healthcare stuff that y'all claim that you want. But, that's a whole other conversation.
Well, you would have to be an anti-imperialist to have that take, though. Yeah.
True.
These people ain't that. They ain't that.
Yeah. But something I wanted to ask, though, because we've used this term quite a bit, and I feel like it's worth defining because I feel like it's so important to not only this conversation, but just understanding the current like global situation. Well, how would you define settler colonialism?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, motherfucker.
I think I could define this just as well as I can. So I had seen this podcast that had this Lakota person kind of describe that there are different forms of colonialism, right? like for example, you have franchise colonialism. This kind of idea that like, if you give like an example of that, like what England did to India, right? England colonized India, but like the point of for the colony of India, right, wasn't for them to take up permanent residence in India. It was to turn India into like kind of this cash cow that produced a bunch of stuff for the UK, right, for the British Empire. So if we talk about settler colonialism, like the difference in settler colonialism is that the what's the kind of goal. It's kind of it feels like it's almost in the name. So like in a way, it's a bit simple, but it's a bit complex. Where like the goal is the actual like land there. So whether or not it's because there's something about the land that has materials you need, or just the fact that like it's kind of like a sort of space that you need to take up, whatever kind of the reason is. The idea is that like the land is the necessary part, and the people are basically unnecessary. So like in contrast, like you have, for example, like we'd say that like black people in America are an internal colony. Well, like for the most part, the reason why we're here is because we were kind of needed, like what we produced in our like exploitation was something valuable to the Europeans. That's why they had slaves. Um, but in this case of Southern colonialism, the people really have no value. Like, yeah, you could enslave them, and you probably typically do. That typically does happen. But like, the goal really isn't to have a revolving door. It's essentially the end goal is essentially no longer have any sort of residents take up the land that you're using. Oh, I think that's very basic. Like, there's definitely more to it, but I think the very basic definition is understanding is that like the goal is the land, and the action of getting that land is genocide, right? It's the removal, displacement, and eventually mass killing.
Like totally
Yeah.
and completely, right?
But yes, the goal
It's the goal. So
Uh,
far, they haven't succeeded, but it's the goal.
Exactly. So I think that's important. Like, yeah, settler colonialism doesn't succeed unless the entire population is wiped out. Like, so like as long as there are populations there, settler colonialism still happens. So like I think it's important because a lot of people like to think that like stuff that happened, like for example, things that happened in the past to like Australia or stuff like right here in Turtle Island is kind of over or done or complete. Final
It's nonsense.
But that's not true. Yeah, it is 100% not true.
Yeah.
It can't, because it can't
Um,
be true. Definitionally, it can't be true. Like what are you saying, Lexi?
So we could define settler colonialism as, I guess you could say, the forceful replacement of a native population by some other group. Could we try
Yes.
to? Is that like too simple, or is that like does that kind of get?
I think that's like given like I think if you were to explain it to like the average person on the street, I think they'd be like, okay, that makes sense.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
I guess that's a simple. Okay, that's a simple one. But tell us, thank you so much for that. But yeah,
Yeah, that's a good definition. Like the total and complete occupation of a native peoples with the goal of removal and replacement. Like that's what settler colonialism is. Like they want to occupy, dominate, and then eventually replace. It's literally like the evil like AI plan of like making everybody on the fucking globe an AI in its image. Like that's the goal of settler colonialism, and it's on a global scale too. The idea is that like this isn't limited to any given state. Like this is what their hope for the entire globe is. Like if you catch a liberal with some liquor in their system, they will straight up tell you that they think America's job is to quite literally play world police and spread America to like every corner of the globe. Yeah, they might tell you that shit sober.
yeah, it was like
Yeah, I mean they're dishonest typically on the subject of colonialism, so typically you got to get them a little bit livened up before they'll be like, "Oh yeah, America should totally colonize this country and that country," And like I remember when I was explaining that I was now against Bernie to a liberal because who knew that I had been quite strongly in his favor at one point because he was now an imperialist. They were like, "Oh, Bernie's an imperialist. I should give him a second look." Like that was that person's fucking response.
oh my god.
Yeah, like this is like this is liberal brain. So like this is why we like define these terms for y'all so that we can make sure that we're operating on the same page, and then you can eventually see how insidious it is for liberals to support this shit. Because like liberals will call this genocidal situation everything but genocide. And like that's the fucking problem. Like They won't even call Yemen a genocide. Like, how is that not clearly a genocide? They won't.
But I think one thing I think it's important to know, and I think that's what really would be like the problem here is that we've kind of made it to where we think of words of genocide, and we've basically been kind of conditioned to think that genocide is what happens one nation on its own people, right? It is an assumption. It's kind of this idea that like things are only really genocides or holocausts if it happens to the citizenry of itself. And and more specifically, it's really only that when it's like European against other European or non-European against European. But anyway, there has to be a European victim for really to count. Unless it's communism, then communism genocides everything. And because of that, it's hard for people to kind of visualize. It's like they'll visualize things as discrimination, maybe, or as apartheid is bad, but they don't really like logically follow that conclusion about that. They wouldn't do it here when it comes to black people. They don't do it overseas because they think it's just war or fighting, and and that's how they're conditioned to. The condition would be that there's somehow like both sides to this, even though in all forms of measurement, there's no way to even like think that way.
Oh, okay, that makes total sense.
Like I think that's one of the major problems with trying to get people to just admit, yeah, this is genocide, because in their mind, who does genocide and who's the receiving end of genocide looks a very specific way.
Not to mention, they talk about genocide as a completed process, don't they? But as we know, genocide by its
they don't see it as something currently happening. Therefore, they don't have a frame of reference of when it's happening.
Exactly, because like to them, it's either already done, and that's why it's a genocide, or it hasn't happened yet, and therefore it's still not a genocide. But it's like no, a genocide, like genocide is an ongoing process of and right now it's against Africans and Palestinians and all kinds of people, and that does include like the Jews, but the people like ironically like trying to like wipe out the Jews are Zionist, reactionary extremist groups in the global south, and unironically like America, who like funds like the terror that goes on in the region and disproportionately affects Jews and Muslims. So like the idea that Palestinians are a threat to the to Jews and not the literal existence of the United States of America, whose foreign policy necessarily puts Jews in harm's way. Like, I mean, that would be an interesting take for somebody to have, but it's definitely the wrong take. The allies of Israel are more of a threat to Jews than the Palestinians ever thought about being. But only anti-imperialists want to have that conversation.
Right, and you can kind of very clearly see that in terms of how the mainstream media, basically across the world, even outlets that someone considers to be relatively progressive, most of them seem to be just towing the line, or whether, or at the very least, just trying to both sides it to make it seem like there is some justification for what is happening to the Palestinians, right? Whether they're talking about, Hamas did a thing, or like I'll give an example. So like there was a situation. So for instance, there are a lot of there's a very high restriction in terms of what can get into the region. Also, the things that the sort of Palestinians can have access to, right? And there was a situation where like a bunch of aid workers, I guess, were trying to send in supplies to Palestinians, and I believe they were trying to send in wheelchairs. And as they were on their way, a bunch of Israeli soldiers descended upon the boat and tried to subdue the aid workers that were trying to get in and to help the Palestinians. And how does the mainstream media cover it? They try to make it seem like the people on the boat that were trying to defend themselves were actually the aggressors in that situation. And it's like, how on earth do you spin it that way? But that seems to happen a lot. And you can really see the complicity of the mainstream media. And that's one of the sort of very clear examples to really show you that like they're really everyone is, or like the sort of Western governments are all in on it, basically, either directly or indirectly.
And it's spitting. Oh man, you got any
And I
more
guess
thoughts?
it also ties in, yeah, I guess it also ties into the sentiment of the peoples themselves. We're kind of alluding to it earlier in regards to the way the people in outside of Israel view settler colonialism in general. But as you can very clearly see just by looking at interviews in Israel, just how the Palestinians have been dehumanized to the point where you have people from all walks of life, people of all ages in Israel or Israelis justifying, even kids justifying the brutality that's happening to Palestinians. You have kids basically talking about. You basically look up, several interviews that Abby Martin did that when she went to Israel to kind of interview various people, and you can see a video that we'll probably put in the show notes where one of the kids is like, "Yeah, I think we need to kick out the Arabs. We need to kill the Arabs," and this is a kid laughing, and another example would be this YouTuber called Nas Daily, and like he's the type of person who just does a bunch of like fun videos about like various facts about the world. But I believe he's an Arab, and he did a video whilst he was in Israel. And the reason why I know this is because my sister was watching it, because my sister watches this YouTuber, and she came across this video, and it goes and the Nas Daily had to blur out the images of the face of the kids, of course, but like these kids were just straight up being like, yeah, no, these people, these Arabs are the enemy. These people, they need to be taken out. And you can kind of see how the indoctrination has been implanted into these peoples from the point, or from the very days that they're born, basically. And it's just far more normalized than it is in areas outside where like people would still have to kind of give this veneer of civility to it, I guess.
Like this kind of, you're talking about like this kind of liberal obsession with like the appearance of peace, where there's actually quite gruesome violence going on.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas if you look at these videos, you have all these people just like, no, we just got to straight up wipe these people out. It's just straight up. They have no,
Yeah.
When you have a camera on them, they know that it's going to be on the internet. They know it's going to go to some mainstream outlet, and yet they just don't seem to see anything wrong with saying, oh yeah, we just need to straight up wipe out all these Palestinian people, like just straight up.
Yeah, there's a very clear divide between the ideas and the sort of way in which Israel itself, the Zionist entity itself, sort of acts, and even the way that its citizens engages, and the way that it's depicted in the international community. And I mean, it was very clearly shown, for example, in the way that what was it? I don't remember who it was. Like during the 11-day war, it was something in relation to the Zionist state. I don't remember if it was like the IDF itself releasing videos about the situation that is going on. In English, it was kind of portraying, oh well, Israel is under attack, all of these bad things are happening, like look at what's going on. In Arabic, I believe the language is, I'm kind of blanking on it right now. You see that they're doing like countdowns to attacks that they're going to do on like the open air prison that they have going on. Like that's what they have going. So the way that they depict themselves to the region and to their citizens is that of the very violent oppressor. But then to everyone else, they try to put up this very big smile to say, oh look, we're nice. We're doing all of these nice things within our nation. But actually, when you take like a sober look, you realize that's not the situation at all.
Yeah, Stella, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about this, since you seem to be interested. You seem to have watched a lot of these interviews, right?
Yeah, I've watched. It's very interesting when you like look at, I guess, on the ground sentiment, like when you kind of compare the two, because like when you ask, because if you sample like 100 Americans, like you would get probably like 5 different answers. Only one of them would probably be like the occupation. Most would just either be like I don't know what's going on, but like either depending on whether or not depending on whether how they feel about Jews or Muslims or both, you probably wouldn't get any sort of like coherentness. But then when you go over and you actually like side by side, like where they're like there, it's I think it's in a way that like I don't think most people were like ready for, because one of the things, actually one of the very interesting things, is if you look at the propaganda, right? Because if you look at the propaganda that Israel puts out to America, it is very much co-opting of liberal sort of intersectional language. They'll talk about like vegan IDF soldiers and like these little cute little infographic things that sort of like drum up some sort of sympathy that gets people on the side. But like when you go over to Israel, right, and you said that the propaganda they give to their citizens, it is like the most like fascistic like forms of like it's like sort of like there was a string of commercials during like 2019 2020 um where like it was straight up like far right agitprop where you have like there's one specific one where it's like there's this boy who like sees his dad die for the fucking country as a military person and like witnesses 9/11 and then like therefore serves and then becomes a police officer and then you see like him juxtaposing watching like a bunch of these quote unquote Antifa and protesters and rioters and then like you see him just like essentially like get so shocked that he kind of goes into like almost like robot mode and you see him like almost like ready to do brutality and that was supposed to be that was like an ad for like you know a kind of pro police ad and that kind of stuff is everywhere in Israel like that is the main way they propagandize to the Israeli public. It is this idea that like you know you're like these holy warriors that is fighting this scourge you know like Hamas has to be rooted out completely and it's like so like it's so interesting watching on the ground like you'll see like how they view. And while there's like a bunch of different views like the Israelis have on the Palestinians, it all kind of ranges from like they're fine as long as they're subjugated essentially, and there's kind of no sort of resolution. We kind of have to continue until there's essentially no one left, you know. Oh, and it's just things like you can like, and the thing is that like you can see like interviews from like years ago, like several years ago from now, and there hasn't seemed to be much like change. Like even like those who are like the Israelis who are like against the occupation who speak out against it, the very few that do like kind of talk about how like you're kind of there's so much there that you're kind of fighting against like merely just like oh well we just educate or change the public's minds. It doesn't feel like it's really feasible. And we saw this kind of in this last election because it's like you had like a I guess more moderate Israeli prime minister at least when we compare to Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And what happens like the day he gets into office? There's another air raid, an airstrike. You know, so it's like it seems like there's definitely a sort of cohesion between like what the government is doing and like the average Israeli, how the average Israeli views the entire like situation.
And it's only been what 11 days, 12 days, something like that. You know,
right.
It goes to show you that like the logic of the situation doesn't change for who's in office, you know. Like the colonial construct is going to colonial construct and all he is a presider over a settler colonial state at the end of the day, you know. So like the idea that like, oh, you can just like vote in like a new administration who's like going to take things in a more progressive direction. Progressing whose material conditions? Because that's the only that's like progress of the material conditions is the only thing related to progress that we as Marxists are and Pan-Africans especially are interested in. So like, you know, it doesn't matter if it's BB, it doesn't matter if it's Bennett, it's always going to be the case that imperialism's logic will win out the day, and the person who represents Israel as its head of state will be a partitioner of that logic. They will be a subscriber to the logic of imperialism, and they will do the bidding of Israel, Zionist interest, because otherwise speaking, you are not long for this world, politically speaking, and possibly literally speaking. It's not like a head of state in Israel has never been assassinated before, unfortunately. So we got to just be super careful to like not let the anti-imperialist discussion die down just because like baby isn't in there anymore, which is like a tendency I see from a lot of so-called anti-imperialists. Oh, we got baby out. Now things are going to be better. Like what? That's no different than saying things are going to be better because, you know, we got Trump out. But like there are people who unironically believe that, you know. So if we apply that, if we have the understanding that Biden being in there doesn't fundamentally change America, we should have that. We should keep that same energy in terms of Israel and when talking about Bennett, you know. So we don't pretend like Bennett and Bebe are the exact same, totally the same people. Of course not. That would be nonsense. But do they have the core interest of the Israeli settler colonial state? You know, at do they have that at the head of their policy? Of course they do. And as long as that's the case, you know, there's still people who end up just doing pro-Zionist work. And as such, there isn't a meaningful distinction to be made between Bibi, Bennett, or whoever ends up coming next. And that's just the perspective your typical anti-imperialist is going to have.
I would say like one of the differences would be it's just that it's almost as though they're just looking for someone to have a civil face upon this imperialist machine type thing.
Yeah, he looks nice. Let me go look at him. I think he's a relatively handsome guy. You know, nice smile, and perfectly palatable. It's baby face.
Isn't he from fucking what state is he from?
Yeah, he's from Haifa. Haifa? Is that how you pronounce it? Haifa. You know, the third largest city in Israel after Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Yeah. So, you know, he's local. He's from Israel, but like the point is, you know, he's still a new rightist. He's a right winger. He doesn't pretend to be otherwise, and often, you know, because he's not Bibi doesn't make him better. You know, I mean, in the same way that like Trump and Biden aren't meaningfully different, but fuck, at least Biden has the decency to not be in a party that, you know, is outwardly a fucking right wing party, even if it's obviously a right wing party in practice. Like the New Right is a right wing, you know, Zionist group, for fuck's sake. So like, how could that ever be in the interest of anti-Zionists? Of course it wouldn't be, but anti-Zionists don't take power in Israel in 2021, and that's the material reality of that situation. So like, Saber, so like, do you feel like there are notable differences between Bibi and Bennett?
Well, again, because I do feel like one of the main things that the appearance of the person that like
you talk about being palatable.
Yeah, because it's like it almost gives it goes back to the whole meme of all right, let's go back to brunch type thing. Let's go back to brunch because it just gives people the excuse, whether it's sort of conscious or even unconscious, that like we don't need to prioritize this more. You can kind of see the energy that was given towards trying to get Trump out of office versus the energy of trying to, for instance, stop the things that Biden is still continuing to do.
But like Biden's face to your average liberal doesn't have the same associations with imperialism that like Trump's does. And so like
Biden has the association with, you know, with Barack Obama, you know, these kinds of things. And so like I really do feel like that does a lot to sort of create this atmosphere of this kind of like sophisticated empire type thing. It allows it to go on without people getting because
people can be like, the system worked, look at it, it corrected course, everything's fine, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, it's not the case.
Yeah, so yeah, we know that a lot of the logic is still continuing, especially when you look on the international context. But like, yeah, like a lot of the things that people were saying that they wanted to get Trump out of office for, Biden is still continuing to do those things, and they're literally not saying anything about it.
Basically, anybody that could have won in 2020 would have been doing the shit, you know. So it's just you can change the head of the beast, but it's still the beast, you know. Like it is what it is. And so, you know, what are your thoughts on all this, Lefty?
I think. I was having a quip of just in my mind was just saying, yeah, we just gotta kill the beast. And also. Another thing that I was thinking about was just the fact that Biden has effectively doubled the police budget since Trump as well, just to kind of also further show the fact that all they're doing is just continuing course on everything that they were doing. You know, like, as we've been saying so far, you know, empire is continuing its course in the way that it's doing it, both internally and externally. We're still seeing the ramping up of war. We're still seeing continued forms of aggression. We're still seeing various sanctions being upheld on Cuba. Like effectively everything that Trump had done is being maintained and then being ramped up even further. So even if you're in the mindset of, oh, well, Trump bad, well, guess what? Nothing of the quote unquote bad things that Trump did is gone now. So like Trump, so even then, it's very clear that all of those quote unquote bad things Trump was doing isn't so bad to the liberals, to the Democrats. It's clearly the case that they not only want to maintain the system, but continue it down its trajectory that it's already going, which of course is ecological destruction.
Yeah, because like, and a lot of people will be like, well, what do you mean he's not? Look at Biden undoing this and Biden undoing that. But it's like, okay, what about everything that didn't get done? You know, what about the moratoriums permanently on rent? You know, like as long as COVID is a thing that we don't have, we don't have 100% vaccination rate for, like rent should be fucking suspended. You know, because the economy has not recovered from COVID. You know, despite what these fucking experts say, the real unemployment rate is something like 23% at this moment. That's the last time I take a look at the data. When you take a look at real unemployment, you know, what about the fact that like we still didn't get a minimum wage increase, you know, from 2009's, you know, very generous increase from $5.50 to $7.25, you know, fucking great. What about the fact that like the material conditions of Black and brown people in the global South continue to be deteriorated by the logic of imperialism that America is at the fucking seat of? So like when people try to say, oh, Biden's done this and done that, well, what about all the shit that he didn't do? What about all the shit that like Trump didn't do that Biden has come in and not done as well? You know, like, and at the very least, Trump had the decency to like repeatedly expand the so-called eviction moratorium. You know, and I think Biden may have done it a time or two, but it's expired here already, and I'm thinking it's probably going to be expiring, you know, before the end of the year, and basically all 50 states and the territories, you know. So this idea that like material conditions for like the people who need them to be improved work the most are being made better. It's just like where like niggas is about to be broke, or niggas is still broke. Niggas is about to be houseless. Niggas is about to be without jobs. You know, it's real wild in this country, and it's like that to the global South as well. And we have to like not pretend that it's otherwise. What's up, Stella?
Oh, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to start to like show, because obviously, you know, this is an African podcast that talks about African issues, and I think it's important for a lot of folks who may not really get why this is, you know, because like yes, there's an importance of like, you know, these are people, this is a culture, this is a group, a population being genocided. That matters completely in and of itself. But I think it is important also to get people to understand why is this important? What does this have to do with Africans? Like, what does that have to do with, you know, if you're someone a nigga in Kansas, what does this have to do with you? You know, if you're listening to this and you're still like, okay, this is all fun and all, but what, and then more specifically, you know, what can you do about it?
You're talking about a message for the niggas in London. Huh?
Yeah. So wherever you are, here's how it affects you, and especially if you're in America, it's probably like pretty like known now that like the settler state of Israel, right, is obviously propped up primarily through the United States. The United States gives the weapons, it gives the funding, it has the military backing. So if anything, someone wanted to try something against Israel, we would be down there. And that's important, obviously, because, you know, your tax levels go there. But more importantly, right, is that there's a sort of ecosystem that interplays between the brutality that the average Palestinian faces from the IDF and what that means for us when we say fighting against police brutality. Something people may not know is that like a lot of the training and tactics that were used in 2020, right, like against protesters, a lot of the police learned that from the IDF. Those were specific tactics the IDF has been using for years that police in the United States were trained on how to do. So like it's not only are we, you know, funding this sort of, this government is funding this sort of this genocide, it's coming back to us in ways like that you wouldn't even think about. So we're basically getting what we're putting in. And, you know, this isn't like, you know, then this isn't the only time in which, the African struggle and the Palestinian struggle have been tied. It's been many times throughout history, especially the 20th century, that it has been. The Black Panthers being a notable group that did work with, I think, with some of the resistance within Palestine during that specific era. Uh, there's always been a connection there, and I think it's important. Well, like obviously the best things you can do is working locally within your community. It's always good. I said this last podcast to have that international mindset, especially when it comes to issues that you may see happen, but you won't ever you'll know like the media is never going to give you the full detail on. It's going to be stuff that you're going to have to like take the time out and look into. You know, your schedule may be busy, you may not have the much time, but the little time you do have, it's good for you to check out other sources in order to get a full understanding. Because it's not just Israel Palestine. There are many other countries that are connected to the struggle here, but you're not gonna. But and for a very good reason, they're not gonna let you know that.
Right. So like, let me get it straight, because that's really interesting. Like you're saying, like the IDF, like quite literally export tactics of repression to the United States that
Yes.
ends up being employed against Africans right here at home. Because that's wild as fuck. I never heard.
Yes.
I never heard that.
I mean, yeah. So and that's the thing, right? One of the things you can look up to kind of know that is that like there's like you can find this image. There's an image of like the image of George Floyd being like having his neck crushed by Derek Chauvin's knee. There are many images that show like picture by picture of that specific move being used against Palestinians by the IDF, like that actual that specific tactic. And you can find so many parallels of that, of just like Palestinians literally on the ground, their necks being crushed by an IDF soldier's knee, and that's a tactic we learned from them. So even up to when it say it's connected, it is quite literally connected. It is for all intents and purposes the same struggle.
It's not even just a relationship. It's the same goddamn thing.
Yeah. Essentially.
And this exists in quite a few elements as well. For example, with regard to the development of intelligence apparatus, Israel is considered to be the most developed. With regard to the element of sort of training militaries and foreign police, it's not just the US as well. Like various police forces and military forces in the global south, including Jamaica, are trained in part by the IDF, and they've been doing by both the IDF and the US. They've been doing that for decades now. So when we're talking about like the existence of many of these oppressive forces, they are usually trained by the Zionist entity. Another element as well are the ways in which economically Israel has a stronghold in quite a few places. As a matter of fact, the current place that they're pushing for a stronghold in quite a few places is, if you can kind of recall a speech that Kamala Harris had at one point, where she claimed that, well, before wars were being fought over oil, now they're going to be fought over water. I say that to kind of point out that also many of the neocolonialist comprador leaders in the global south, especially in Africa and countries like Jamaica, they're looking to Israel to sell off their water systems. Currently, Jamaica's water system is public, whereas our electricity is privatized. It's mostly sold off to South Korean capitalists. And now our government is looking to sell our water system to Israel, and there are quite a few neocolonial comprador governments across Africa that are also choosing to go directly to Israel to try to privatize their water and sell it to Israel. Because as we know, throughout the upcoming climate catastrophe, one of the most important things and one of the most precious things is going to be water. That's precisely why it's now a commodity on the stock exchange, right? So what we can kind of establish for all of this is recognizing that this when we kind of understand Israel's role in the hegemony, we recognize that it exists in quite a few elements. It's not even just across defense, or not even just across intelligence, but also in the very economic elements of society as well.
Yeah, and that will definitely be something that will be more of a concern over time as like freshwater supply becomes increasingly scarce. And it seems like a lot of the things that some people are sort of hedging their bets on right now is mass water desalination projects type things. And you can only imagine, number one, like how many resources it will take to develop the machines that will be able to do that. Number two, like the fact that those things have not even, the sort of R&D behind those kinds of technologies are not even in place right now. Obviously R&D is going into it, but the technology is not there yet. And when you consider these sort of IPCC reports and various other climate reports indicating that we have like 1 or 2 decades left, it really does paint this picture that like we need to do something about this right now. And like all of this is connected into this one system. And sort of Israeli government is an integral part of that too, based on kind of things that you've been talking about. All right, so like, why don't we spend the last few minutes talking about potential solutions? Try to leave it on a hopeful note, revolutionary optimism and all that. Do you know what I mean? So, anyone got any suggestions on how we can fight this system and things that we can do to potentially save our species, and I guess in particular for this episode, the Palestinians, and what we can do to help them? What we can do to help? Yeah.
So one thing I'll say is that this is maybe the only time where I think some sort of, I know this is the word that should not be named, but electoral strategies could have an effect. And what I mean by that specifically, right, is that if you have, this is more local and state. If you have like a local principality or like governor that has some sort of like specifically sort of penchant against BDS or some very like loyalty to Israel, like things that can like, so like the ways people who've already tried to organize, who can push for like a change in like some sort of like, if like for example if BDS is which is for people who don't know, is like boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and it's a group that like essentially like organizes against like Israeli propaganda, and I think others as well, but I think it's that one's in particular. It's a Palestinian group, and one of the things that even like it's kind of like, so one of the things in America that's kind of like lauded is our freedom of speech, but like there are many states that like if you support BDS, you can't run for political office, you can't do a lot of things. Hell, like even I think even like I was at Florida or Texas, where it's like if you were a teacher, like to be a teacher, you had to like essentially like disavow BDS and like support Israel. So in that situation, putting pressure on political leaders in that specific way, I think can hold, when it's organized, right, and it has some like backing against it to actually make them do it, can actually be fruitful in terms of just fighting propaganda. Because I think that's one of the biggest things, is that like one of the strongest things that happened to like at least the last before the second airstrike was the fact that like the narrative that usually happens when these sort of things happen was not nearly as strong, and that caused them a lot of they probably caused a lot of repression in terms of censoring stuff that's on social media, because just the narrative that is usually there just doesn't work. I think the more we can focus on that, the more we can get people to understand, because once someone understands, unless they are straight up just Zionist and they have this sort of Islamophobic view of people, which there are quite a few people here. I think a lot of people can basically say that, yeah, no, there doesn't at least seem to be a direct like material interest for the average person, at least in the United States, to support Israel. They just more often than not just don't know anything, or they just view it as something that's happening somewhere else because religion. That's one that I think that would be one of my like I think solutions that could possibly work.
Yeah, 100%. I would also recommend looking into BDS. Look specifically into the specific demands that the BDS movement is making, because there is a lot of Zionist propaganda out there wherein they sort of, how do I say, they list every single company that has any relationship to Israel at all. And at that point, you kind of realize that there's the goal is to give you so many things to avoid that you just think, oh, it's impossible to avoid it. But actually, if you look at the specific list that the BDS movement has, it's not nearly as many companies that are as entrenched in the development of the Zionist entity in the way that it is. So you can actually afford to avoid these companies. So I would recommend looking more into it and being a bit more vigilant to it. Another element, I think, if we're going to talk specifically about the ways in which we can push back against it, at least in ourselves and within our communities, is to educate ourselves, honestly. Try to seek out a bit more information. We're going to have quite a few links in the show notes to resources, videos, etc., so that you can get more information on the situation that's going on, so you can have a better understanding of what's happening, so that you can sort of do things better in your life. But also, if we're going to talk specifically about organized activity that we can do, I think right now, if we're talking specifically about the dealing with the Zionist entity, I'm not going to lie, I think it's primarily going to have to be dealt with by the people in the region. And what we can do ourselves is to ensure that we fend off particularly propaganda and the consent that's being manufactured within our communities, and try to sort of push back on it that way. Because we, within our communities, I don't believe necessarily have sufficient resources to be sending to other places just yet. Once we build that kind of capacity, then of course we can try to do that. But I think right now I do believe that the region is dealing with the situation very well. And if we can sort of ensure that our nations pull back from supporting the Zionist entity in the way that they are today, we can definitely see significant change in what's going on the ground.
Well, yeah. So yeah, we appreciate you all tuning into this episode. If you've somehow made it this far, then yeah, we urge you to continue to educate yourselves and do what you can to support the Palestinians who are currently suffering under this regime. We hope that you stick around for the episodes to come in the future. I am your host, Saber. You can find me at Sabernetics on YouTube and Twitter. I make video essays and the occasional shit post on Twitter. And yeah, I'll hand it over to my co-host to give the little outro, and we'll leave it there. Lecton, go ahead.
Thank you so much for listening. Do appreciate it. I am on Twitter at LectonPHX, LectenPHX. That's pretty much where you're gonna find me. I don't really tweet that often, but when I do, it's fire as hell. Check it out. And then Shabir, do you have an outro you want to say as well?
No, I don't have a perceivable Twitter. I do not exist outside of this podcast and cannot be reached. But I do appreciate those who decided to listen anyways, despite that.
Well, I would say on Jabir's behalf, I would say check out Bread Theory if you wanna go ahead and educate yourself.
Oh yeah, I suppose.
Yeah,
Bread
why
Theory,
not?
yeah.
Yeah, give a little shill for Bread Theory. Why not?
All right, yeah. Bread Theory, it's our political education server where we do quite a lot of reading, one-on-one videos, one-on-one readings, group readings. What else do we do? Video essays of the sort that Saber and Lecton and Stella get into, and more. You can hit up Saber, or you can hit myself up at bread.theory1750@gmail.com about possibly joining the Bread Theory server. And of course, that link will be in the server if you want to support us on Patreon. That does go into getting y'all more enlightening and knowledgeable content and on an even more frequent basis than we're currently able to do it. So yeah, that's definitely something y'all can do.
Yeah, and last but certainly not least, Stella, go ahead.
So you can follow me at the Cosmic Hobbyist on my YouTube channel, at the Cosmic Menace on my Twitter, and Jupiter's Arcade. Actually, I think it's the Cosmic Hobbyist now as well on Twitch. I make video essays, I stream, and I make fire tweets when I do happen to be on the hell side that is Twitter.
Cool. Well, we appreciate you watching, and we will see you in the next episodes.